You don't belong here." The words cut through the first-class cabin like a blade dragged across glass. Sharp, public, unapologetic. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. A champagne flute froze halfway to a man's lips. Somewhere, a seat motor hummed and then went silent, as if the aircraft itself had decided to listen. Richard Coleman stood in the aisle, shoulders squared, chest forward. A man who had never learned how to whisper because the world had always leaned in to hear him. His tailored navy suit was flawless, pressed so sharply it looked weaponized. The cuff of his white shirt peeked out just enough to show a gold watch that cost more than most cars on the tarmac outside JFK. His face was flushed, not from embarrassment, but from authority exercised without resistance for decades. Across from him, in seat 1A, sat a young woman who did not move. Alyssa Morgan stayed exactly where she was, back against the leather, hands resting loosely in her lap. Hoodie pulled up around her neck, her breathing slow, measured, controlled in a way that came from practice, not fear. The soft grey fabric of her sweatshirt looked almost out of place in a cabin that smelled of bergamot, polished wood, and expensive silence. For a moment, no one spoke. The cabin lights reflected off brushed metal and glass dividers. Outside the window, rain slid down in thin lines, blurring the runway lights into streaks of white and red. 30,000 feet of promise, not yet reached. Richard looked down at her like a man discovering something rotten in a space that had been curated for perfection. He didn't see her face first. He saw the sneakers. Scuffed, practical, not designer. He saw the backpack tucked neatly under the seat in front of her. Black, worn. No logo screaming status. He saw the hoodie. Casual. Soft, and then finally he saw her skin. Something hardened behind his eyes. "This is first class," he said, louder now, as if volume itself could bend reality. "Seat 1A. That seat is not for you." Alyssa lifted her eyes. Not quickly, not defensively, just enough to meet his gaze. "Yes," she said. Her voice was calm, almost gentle, the kind of tone that unsettled people who expected resistance or apology. Richard laughed, a short, humorless sound. He glanced around the cabin, searching for witnesses, allies, an audience that would validate what he believed should be obvious. The other passengers didn't look back. A man in his late 60s pretended to be absorbed in the stock prices on his phone. A woman across the aisle adjusted her scarf, eyes fixed anywhere but the confrontation. No one wanted to be involved. This was not their problem. Not yet. Richard leaned closer. Too close. His cologne was sharp, expensive, aggressive. "Listen," he said, lowering his voice into something patronizing. "I don't know how you got past the gate agent, but you're in the wrong cabin. People pay real money to sit here." Alyssa blinked once. She glanced down at the digital display embedded in the armrest. Seat 1A. She knew that already. She had checked it 3 times since boarding. Old habits, precision, verification. Then she looked back at him. "I'm ticketed for this seat," she said. The words landed softly. They did not challenge him. They did not beg. They simply existed. Richard's mouth tightened. "Ticketed," he repeated, as if tasting something unpleasant. "First class on this route costs over $10,000. Are you telling me you spent that kind of money?" A beat. Alyssa answered honestly. "No." That was all he needed. Richard smiled. It was not a friendly expression. It was the look of a man who believed he had just won an argument without effort. "Exactly," he said, straightening. "So let's not waste everyone's time. Stand up. Go back to economy. Whatever row they stuck you in. 40. 50. Somewhere behind the curtain." The words "behind the curtain" hung in the air, heavy with implication. Alyssa did not stand. She felt the eyes now. She didn't need to look to know they were there. Curiosity, judgment, calculation. People were running silent math in their heads. Hoodie, backpack, young, black. Probability of mistake. Her pulse stayed steady. "Sir," she said, a little firmer now, "you're blocking the aisle." That did it. Richard's face darkened. His jaw flexed. This was not how this was supposed to go. People like her were supposed to shrink, to apologize, to scramble. He slapped his leather briefcase down into seat 1B with a dull thud that made several passengers flinch. "Unbelievable," he muttered. "The nerve." That was when the flight attendant noticed. Emily Carter had been in the galley pouring champagne, her movements automatic after 20 years in the air. She recognized the sound of trouble the way some people recognize thunder before rain, raised voices, that specific edge of entitlement. She stepped into the aisle, smile already in place, professional and tight. "Is there a problem here?" she asked. Richard didn't hesitate. He pointed at Alyssa like a prosecutor presenting evidence. "Yes, there's a problem. You have a security issue. This passenger is sitting in a seat she didn't pay for. I want her removed before we push back." Emily followed his finger. Her eyes met Alyssa's. She knew that face. Not personally, but officially. The manifest had been clear. The briefing that morning had been very clear. Emily paused. Just a fraction too long. "Sir," she said carefully, "this passenger is in her assigned seat." Richard turned toward her so fast, his suit jacket pulled tight across his shoulders. "Did you actually check?" he snapped, "or are you just trying to avoid a scene?" "I've checked the manifest," Emily replied. Her voice stayed even, but something cooled inside it. "Everything is correct?" Richard laughed again. Louder. Bitter. "The manifest is wrong," he said. "I fly this route twice a month. First class is for business professionals, quiet people. I have a merger to review. I will not sit next to street culture." The phrase landed like a slap. Alyssa felt it then. Not fear. Not anger. Something colder. Something sharper. A memory of rooms where she had been underestimated and watched people destroy themselves without realizing it. She slowly slid her headphones down around her neck. Richard saw the movement and mistook it for submission. Good, he thought. Finally. He had no idea that the story had just begun. The word street culture didn't echo. It sank. It settled into the cabin like something heavy dropped into water, rippling outward in silence. Emily Carter felt it land in her chest before she felt anger, before embarrassment, before the professional instinct to smooth things over kicked in. She saw it in the way the man in seat 2B stopped pretending to read, in the way the woman across the aisle pressed her lips together, eyes flicking anywhere but the aisle. No one spoke. No one defended. Silence became complicity. Alyssa Morgan did not look away. She studied Richard Coleman the way an engineer studies a failing system. Calm, precise, looking past the noise to the cause. She noticed the slight tremor in his right hand, where he gripped the armrest, the faint sheen of sweat at his temple. Not rage. Control slipping. Men like him confused volume for authority, intimidation for power. Emily took a half step forward, instinctively placing herself between them. "Sir," she said, a little firmer now, "I need you to lower your voice and take your seat. We are about to push back." Richard turned on her, eyes blazing. "Do not tell me to lower my voice. I know the captain. I know people at corporate. You don't want this escalating." Behind him, Alyssa watched Emily's shoulders tighten. She saw the calculation happen in real time. Power versus procedure. Ego versus policy. Emily had dealt with men like this for decades. Men who confused frequent flyer status with ownership. Men who believed consequences were for other people. "Mr. Coleman," Emily said, choosing her words carefully, "if you continue to disrupt the cabin, I will have to notify the flight deck." Richard snorted. "Go ahead. Call them. I'll explain how you let a stowaway sit in first class." That word. Stowaway. He threw it like a match. Alyssa felt something shift behind her ribs. Not hurt. Resolve. The kind that came from knowing exactly how much damage a man like this could cause if left unchecked, not just to her, but to everyone watching. She picked up her tablet, not to hide, but to disengage. She slid the screen back on, the glow illuminating lines of dense equations and schematics. Fuel flow ratios, thermal efficiency curves, numbers most people would never bother to understand. Her world. Quiet, orderly, honest. Richard noticed. Of course he did. "Oh, look at that," he said loudly, leaning back into his seat but angling his body toward her, claiming space. "Homework. That's cute. What is that, community college physics?" Emily opened her mouth. Alyssa spoke first. "It's a review of high bypass turbofan efficiency," she said without looking up. "Specifically, the Rolls-Royce Trent series. I'm checking fuel burn variances from the last Dubai leg." Richard blinked. "1+2." Then he laughed. Too hard. Too fast. "Wikipedia words," he said. "You memorize a few fancy terms and think that almost makes you an expert." Alyssa turned her head slowly. When she looked at him, her expression wasn't angry. It was bored. "I don't memorize," she said. "I analyze." Emily watched Richard's face flicker. Surprise, then recovery. He leaned back, spreading his papers across the tray table, deliberately encroaching on the shared armrest. Establishing territory. I hire engineers, he said. Real ones. MIT. Stanford. They don't dress like you. They understand professionalism. That did it. Emily inhaled sharply. Sir. Enough. Richard ignored her. This industry is built by serious people, he continued, voice rising. Not diversity projects who think they're owed a seat at the table. The air felt thinner. Pressurized metal and recycled oxygen suddenly inadequate. Alyssa closed her tablet. The click of the case snapping shut was quiet, but it cut through the noise. She turned fully toward him now, meeting his stare head-on. Her eyes were steady, clear, unflinching. You seem very concerned with my qualifications, she said. Why? Richard leaned forward, finger jabbing the air inches from her shoulder. Because standards matter. Because people like you cheapened spaces you didn't earn. Emily stepped between them again, heart pounding. Sir, keep your hands to yourself. I didn't touch her, Richard snapped. I'm educating her. Alyssa looked at his finger, then back at his face. One of us, he said quietly now, voice dropping into something almost intimate. That's the difference. You'll never be one of us. Emily saw it then, the line he had crossed. Not policy. Not decorum. Humanity. Alyssa stood, not abruptly, not dramatically. She unbuckled her seatbelt with a soft click that sounded impossibly loud in the stunned cabin. She rose to her full height, taller than she looked when seated, presence expanding without effort. Richard smirked. What? Running to the bathroom to cry? Tohuna, Alyssa said. Her voice was level. Controlled. I'm going to speak with the pilot. For a heartbeat, Richard just stared. Then he laughed. A deep, barking sound that turned heads. The pilot? He said. You think the pilot wants to talk to you? Go ahead. Knock on the door. They'll have you arrested for attempting to breach the cockpit. I'd love to see that. Emily reached out instinctively. Ms. Morgan, you can't just... It's all right, Alyssa said, lifting a hand gently. Not dismissive, assuring. Please tell Captain Reynolds I need a word. Emily hesitated. Her training screamed at her. Procedure, security, boundaries. But something else overrode it. The manifest, the briefing, the look in Alyssa's eyes. Tell him, Alyssa added, it's regarding weight distribution in seat 1B. Richard roared with laughter. Weight distribution. That's rich. Alyssa didn't look back as she walked toward the front of the cabin. Her steps were unhurried, measured. The way someone walks when they know exactly where they're going. Behind her, Richard turned to the man in seat 2B, a younger guy in a grey suit who had been trying desperately to disappear into his headphones. Richard gestured with his glass of scotch. Can you believe this? The audacity. The man offered a weak smile, eyes darting. I just want to get to Zurich. Oh, we will, Richard said confidently. She won't. Give it 10 minutes. Up front, Emily stood frozen for a second, then moved. Her hands shook as she picked up the interphone. She glanced back once. Alyssa stood by the cockpit door, calm, waiting. No anger, no fear, just certainty. Emily swallowed and pressed the button. "Captain Reynolds," she said quietly, "Ms. Morgan is requesting a conversation." A pause. Then, "Put her on." Emily handed Alyssa the handset. Richard leaned back into his seat, swirling the amber liquid in his glass, satisfaction blooming. He had seen this before, had made this happen before. People removed, careers ruined, power asserted. He had no idea the plane had already started to tilt, imperceptibly, toward a very different destination. The cockpit door did not open slowly. It released. A soft mechanical click, then a decisive unlatching from inside, the kind that did not ask who was knocking. Emily Carter felt her breath catch. She had worked this aircraft for years, and had seen that door open only under two circumstances: emergencies or authority. Captain Michael Reynolds stepped out immediately. He did not look irritated. He did not look rushed. He looked alert in a way that tightened the room. Silver hair neatly combed, 4 stripes sharp against his shoulders. His eyes went first to Alyssa Morgan, then briefly to Emily, then passed them down the aisle toward seat 1B. Richard Coleman straightened as soon as he saw the captain. He rose halfway out of his seat, already smoothing his jacket, already rehearsing the version of events where he was the wronged party. This was his arena. Executives understood executives. "Aha!" Richard called out, voice carrying. "Captain, thank you for coming back. I'm Richard Coleman, Diamond Tier." I raised the complaint. Captain Reynolds did not look at him. His focus stayed on Alyssa. "Ms. Morgan," he said, voice calm, respectful, pitched low enough that only the front of the cabin could hear. "We received your notification on the flight system." Emily mentioned a concern. "Yes," Alyssa said. "There is." Richard stepped forward, physically inserting himself into the space between them. "Captain, this woman is harassing me. She's sitting in a seat she clearly couldn't afford and refuses to follow cabin etiquette. I want her moved to economy or restrained." For the first time, Captain Reynolds looked at Richard. The pause was subtle. A flicker. Confusion first. Then something colder. Recognition of a situation spiraling toward something much larger than a seat dispute. "Sir," the captain said, voice dropping a register, "please return to your seat. The seatbelt sign is illuminated." "I'm not sitting down until you deal with her," Richard snapped, finger pointing inches from Alyssa's face. "She's a fraud. Check her ticket. I bet it's fake." Alyssa did not flinch. She turned her head slightly toward the captain, her voice precise, controlled. "Captain Reynolds, Mr. Coleman believes I am occupying this seat illegally. He has also verbally abused me, poked my chair, and demanded my removal based on assumptions about who I am." "I did not poke her," Richard barked. I tapped the seat. Alyssa continued, ignoring him completely. "Before we address that, may I ask you a technical question?" Richard scoffed loudly. "Oh my God, here we go again with the fake engineering talk. How is the fuel flow on the number 2 engine? Alyssa asked. I noticed a slight vibration variance in the maintenance log from the Dubai leg. The cabin froze. Captain Reynolds's eyes widened just enough to be noticeable. His posture stiffened, instincts snapping to attention. We adjusted the flow valve during the layover, he said slowly. It's running within 0.5% efficiency now. Alyssa nodded. That aligns with what I saw. Thank you. Richard stared at them, blinking. Captain, she's reading Wikipedia pages. She's trying to sound smart. Arrest her. Captain Reynolds did not respond. He was looking at Alyssa with new eyes now. Calculating, reassessing. How did you access the Dubai maintenance log? He asked. I reviewed it this morning, Alyssa said, before I approved the flight plan. Silence. Richard's glass tilted in his hand, scotch sloshing dangerously close to the rim. Approved, he repeated. Approved the flight plan. What is she talking about? Alyssa turned to him then, really turned, meeting his gaze fully. I am a student, she said. I'm completing my master's in aerospace engineering. Richard exhaled sharply, relief surging. There. You hear that? A student. That's my hobby, Alyssa added. The word landed wrong. What I do for fun, she continued. I don't do this for money. Richard laughed, brittle now. Captain, this is ridiculous. Remove her. Captain Reynolds took a step closer to Richard. He was taller, broader, a presence forged by decades of command where lives depended on calm decisions. Mr. Coleman, the captain said sharply, I need you to sit down and be quiet. Don't you dare talk to me like that, Richard snarled. I know the owner of this airline. I'll have your badge, your pension. The hum of the cabin seemed to die. Even the air felt still. Alyssa let out a short, humorless laugh. She reached into the pocket of her hoodie. Richard saw the movement and smirked. What now? A fake ID. She pulled out a lanyard. Not paper, not plastic. Metal. Black and gold. Heavy. It caught the cabin light and threw it back hard. Clearance markings etched deep. Global access. Richard's mouth opened. Nothing came out. You said you know the owner, Alyssa said softly, stepping closer. You said you know the executives, the vice presidents. I do, Richard stammered, sweat breaking across his forehead. I play golf with Bill. There is no Bill, Alyssa said. The vice president of operations is named Emily Carter. Emily felt her knees go weak. And the chief executive, Alyssa continued, her voice gaining strength, is my father. James Morgan. He founded this airline 30 years ago. Richard shook his head violently. No, that's not... My father retired 6 months ago, Alyssa said. He transferred controlling interest of the fleet to the holding company. She glanced down at the floor, then back up at him. To this holding company. Captain Reynolds cleared his throat. He looked at Richard with a mixture of pity and finality. Mr. Coleman, he said. The passenger you have been harassing is Alyssa Morgan. Richard whispered. She owns... She is the chairwoman of the board, the captain finished. She owns the leasing firm that holds title to this aircraft. Richard's eyes darted to Alyssa's hoodie, her sneakers, her braids. She looks like a black student, Alyssa said. Yes, and I am also the woman who signs the checks that pay for the fuel, the crew, and the seat you are sitting in. She took one more step forward. You told me I was in the wrong seat, she said. You were right. I am. Because technically, I own every seat on this plane. Captain Reynolds added quietly. Sir, she owns this aircraft. Richard's face drained of color. Phones came up. Someone in seat 2B had been filming for a while now. Put that away, Richard shrieked, lunging weakly. Sit down, Alyssa said. He froze. Now, she added. His knees buckled. He collapsed back into seat 1B, breathing fast, eyes wild. Miss Morgan, he said, voice trembling, pivoting desperately. If I had known. That's the problem, Alyssa replied. You shouldn't need to know. She turned back to the captain. Captain Reynolds, I do not feel safe flying with this passenger. The captain nodded immediately. I agree. Richard gasped. You can't. We're in the air. Captain Reynolds checked his watch. We are currently passing over Nova Scotia. We have sufficient fuel to divert. Divert? Richard screamed. Think of the cost. Alyssa looked down the cabin. Ladies and gentlemen, she said, raising her voice just enough. If we divert to remove this passenger, I will personally refund every ticket and provide a travel voucher of $5,000 for the delay. Does anyone object? Get him off, someone shouted. A ripple of agreement. Alyssa turned back to Richard. It appears the shareholders have spoken. Captain Reynolds nodded. Diverting to Halifax. The cockpit door closed. Richard sat shaking, the plane banking left, the reality finally sinking in. The aircraft banked hard to the left. Not violently, but decisively, the way a mind changes after a final decision has been made. The cabin tilted. Glasses rattled. A few startled gasps rippled through first class, followed by a silence so thick it pressed against the ears. Richard Coleman gripped the armrests, as if the seat might reject him next. No, he whispered. No. No. Across the aisle, Alyssa Morgan sat back down in seat 1A. She moved slowly, deliberately, the way people do when they are done proving a point. She adjusted her seatbelt, lifted her headphones, paused, then left them resting around her neck. She did not look at Richard. She didn't need to. The descent began. Outside the windows, the sky darkened. Grey cloud swallowed the light. Rain streaked sideways now, driven by wind off the Atlantic. The luxury of the cabin felt thinner with every passing minute, as if altitude had been the only thing holding it together. Captain Reynolds's voice came over the intercom, calm, steady, ironclad. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Reynolds. We are diverting to Halifax Stanfield International Airport due to a passenger safety issue. Please remain seated with your seat belts fastened. Local authorities will be meeting the aircraft upon landing. Thank you for your cooperation. A murmur rolled through the cabin. Not anger. Approval. Richard shook his head over and over, hands trembling. "You can't do this," he muttered, louder now, desperation leaking through the cracks. "My meeting. My deal. This is illegal." Emily Carter stood a few rows away, posture no longer deferential. Her voice, when she spoke, was that of a safety officer, not a service professional. "Sir, you need to remain seated." Richard lurched halfway up. "I need the restroom." "No," Emily said. Flat. Final. It wasn't her voice that stopped him. It was Alyssa's. "Sit down." 2 words. Calm. Controlled. Delivered without volume, without threat, and with absolute ownership of the space they occupied. Richard sat. The rest of the descent passed in a blur of mechanical sounds and human discomfort. Seatbelts tightened, tray tables locked. The aircraft cut through turbulence that tossed the cabin just enough to remind everyone that metal and air were still in charge. Richard stared straight ahead, jaw clenched, sweat darkening the collar of his shirt. He didn't drink the rest of his scotch. He didn't touch his phone. He just breathed, shallow and fast, running numbers in his head that no longer added up. Alyssa, meanwhile, spoke quietly with Emily near the galley. Not about him, about coursework, about a problem set she was finishing, about a turbine efficiency model that wasn't behaving the way the textbook promised. Emily listened, nodding, stunned not by the content, but by the normalcy of it, as if this diversion, this public collapse, was simply weather passing through. The wheels hit the runway with a heavy thud. Reverse thrusters roared, loud and violent, shaking the cabin. The aircraft slowed, rain hammering the windows, grey and relentless. They taxied not toward a gate, but toward a remote stand far from the terminal, floodlights cutting through mist like interrogation lamps. The plane stopped. The seatbelt sign stayed on. Richard unbuckled anyway, jerking to his feet, clutching his briefcase. "I need to speak to someone," he said, voice cracking. "This is a misunderstanding." Emily turned towards him, eyes hard. "Sit down." He hesitated. Alyssa didn't raise her voice. "This isn't a negotiation." Richard sank back into his seat, shoulders collapsing inward. For the first time since boarding, he looked small. The forward cabin door opened. Cold air rushed in, sharp with jet fuel and rain. 2 figures stepped on board, boots heavy against the aircraft floor. Dark navy uniforms, yellow reflective stripes, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. They did not rush. They did not posture. They walked with the quiet confidence of men who did not care who someone used to be. Captain Reynolds met them at the door and pointed once, cleanly toward seat 1B. The officers moved down the aisle. Every phone was up now. No one pretended otherwise. "Richard Coleman?" the lead officer asked. Richard stood, smoothing his jacket out of instinct. "Yes." "Thank God you're here. I want to report a hijacking." The officer didn't react. "You are being detained for interfering with flight crew and causing a disturbance." "Detained?" Richard's voice broke. I'm a CEO. I have rights. Turn around, the officer said. Hands behind your back. Richard pulled away. You can't handcuff me. Do you know who I am? The second officer took his wrist. Strong, efficient. The click of metal was loud in the quiet cabin. Once, twice, final. As they led him toward the door, a man in seat 2B stood up, phone held high, camera rolling. Hey, Richard, he called out. Say hi to Twitter. There are 40,000 people watching live. Richard's head snapped up. What? I started streaming when you called her a stowaway, the man said. You're trending. #1 in the country. Richard lunged weakly toward the phone. The officers tightened their grip. Move, one of them said. At the door, Richard twisted one last time, eyes wild, searching for Alyssa. Please, he said, voice stripped bare. I'll apologize. I'll do anything. Alyssa lifted her glass of sparkling water, took a sip. Goodbye, Mr. Coleman, she said. Enjoy Halifax. They took him out into the rain. The door slammed shut. For a second, no one spoke. Then, from somewhere far back in the aircraft, a slow clap started. One pair of hands, then another. It spread forward, row by row, until the entire plane was filled with applause. Not loud, not chaotic, steady, cathartic. Alyssa didn't stand. She didn't smile. She put her headphones back on, reopened her tablet, and returned to her equations as if the world hadn't just rearranged itself around her. On the ground, in a concrete holding room that smelled of disinfectant and metal, Richard Coleman sat alone on a bench bolted to the floor, his belt, his shoelaces, his watch. All gone. His phone confiscated. Hours passed without meaning. When they finally allowed him one call, his hands shook so badly he almost dropped the receiver. He didn't call his wife. He didn't call a lawyer. He called his chief financial officer. It's a misunderstanding, Richard said hoarsely. I need the legal team. I can still make Zurich. There was a long silence on the other end. Richard, the voice said quietly, you don't understand. What? He snapped. What don't I understand? The board met, the CFO said. You were terminated. Effective immediately. Moral conduct clause. Richard slid down the wall until he hit the floor. That's not even the worst of it, the voice continued. The deal collapsed. The buyer pulled out. No, Richard whispered. Not exactly, the CFO said. They changed the terms. Hostile takeover. Pennies on the dollar. Who? Richard asked, though he already knew. Parent company, the voice said. Morgan Capital. Richard dropped the phone. High above the clouds, Flight 882 leveled out and turned back toward its original path. The sun broke through the storm, painting the sky in gold and violet. Alyssa Morgan looked out the window, the world bright and clean again, and went back to work. Morning came without mercy. Richard Coleman woke to fluorescent light and the smell of bleach, his mouth dry, his head pounding with the kind of ache that didn't belong to hangovers, but to consequences. The holding room was smaller than he remembered, or maybe he had finally noticed. Concrete walls, a steel bench, a toilet bolted to the floor with no seat. Everything designed to remind you that comfort was conditional. A guard slid a paper cup of water through the slot. It splashed against the floor when Richard's hands missed it the first time. He drank anyway. Hours later, he was released into the grey daylight outside the airport detention center. Rain still fell, thin and relentless, flattening his hair, soaking the shoulders of his once perfect suit. Cameras waited. Not one or two. A wall of them. Lenses lifted the moment they saw his face. "Flash, flash, flash, Mr. Coleman, do you regret your comments? Are you racist? Did you know who she was? Your company's stock is crashing. Any comment?" Richard raised his briefcase like a shield. It was empty. He had nothing left to carry. A cab pulled up. The driver glanced at him, then at the phone mounted on the dash, news footage playing silently. Recognition sparked. The doors locked. The cab drove away. By the time Richard made it back to the hotel, soaked and shaking, his phone buzzed non-stop. Notifications stacked faster than he could read them. Emails from the board. Messages from investors. Missed calls from his wife. From reporters. From people who had once laughed at his jokes on golf courses. He didn't answer any of them. He collapsed onto the edge of the bed and stared at the wall, watching the ticker scroll across the television. His name. His face. The headline beneath it. Brutal and clean. Logistics CEO removed from flight after racist tirade. The stock graph beside it fell like a cliff. Across the Atlantic, Flight 882 cruised smoothly now, sunlight spilling across the cabin. Breakfast service moved quietly. The mood had changed. Something had been exhaled. Emily Carter set a fresh glass of sparkling water on Alyssa Morgan's tray table. "Breakfast in about an hour," she said. Her smile this time was real. "Thank you," Alyssa replied. She had already sent the email. Subject line: Asset review. Body: short. Surgical. Approval granted. On the ground, in a glass-walled boardroom overlooking New Jersey docks, the directors of Coleman Logistics sat in silence. Lawyers lined the walls. Phones buzzed. A screen at the front showed the live feed. The clip everyone had seen. The moment. The words. One director cleared his throat. "We have a moral conduct clause." Another nodded. "Unanimous?" No one objected. When Richard finally called his chief financial officer again, his voice was hoarse. "Tell them to hold. We can spin this." The reply was immediate. "It's too late. Creditors called in the loans. We have no liquidity." "But the deal," Richard said. "The Zurich deal." There was a pause. Then the truth. The buyer pulled out. "No," Richard whispered. "They didn't pull out," the CFO corrected. "They took over. Hostile. They're stripping the brand. The name is toxic." Richard slid down the wall until he was sitting on the carpet, back against the bed. His reflection stared at him from the dark television screen. Eyes sunken. Tie gone. The suit that had once been armor, now just wet fabric clinging to a man who could no longer command a room. The email arrived 10 minutes later. From Morgan Capital. Subject: revised terms. He read it once, then again. each line precise. Cold. The final sentence cut deepest. Please consider this the cost of your education. He closed his eyes. Weeks passed. The world moved forward without him. By the time Richard returned to New York, he was on a no-fly list across multiple airlines. He rented a car and drove through rain and traffic and shame, gripping the wheel until his hands cramped. When he reached his townhouse on the Upper East Side, the locks had been changed. A note from his wife's attorney waited at the door. Assets frozen, divorce filed, reputation cited. He didn't argue. He couldn't. 3 days after the flight, Alyssa Morgan walked into the headquarters of what used to be Coleman Logistics. She wasn't wearing a hoodie this time. She wore a black suit tailored to precision, hair pulled back, no jewelry, no excess. Just presence. The lobby went silent. She didn't take the elevator. She walked the stairs. She passed cubicles filled with people holding their breath, bracing for impact. She went straight to the corner office. The nameplate on the desk still read Richard Coleman, Chief Executive Officer. Alyssa picked it up, turned it over once, dropped it into the trash. She turned to the gathered staff in the hallway. Faces tight. Fear everywhere. "Good morning," she said. Her voice carried without effort. "My name is Alyssa Morgan. As of this morning, I am the majority shareholder." A ripple moved through the crowd. "I know you're worried about your jobs," she continued. "You should be worried about culture. That's what we're fixing." Someone in the back exhaled. "We are not liquidating people," Alyssa said. "We are liquidating toxicity. If you work hard, you stay. If you were here because of proximity to power, you have 10 minutes to clear your desk." The cheer that followed wasn't loud. It was relieved. Efficiency rose within a quarter. Turnover dropped. Profits followed. High above the city, Alyssa sat in a conference room and reviewed numbers with the same calm she had shown at 30,000 feet. Systems corrected themselves when rot was removed. It wasn't personal. It was structural. 6 months later, winter cut through Newark like a blade. Richard Coleman sat on a plastic bench in a bus terminal, coat too thin, shoulders hunched. He checked his watch. Cheap. Digital. The Rolex had gone to cover legal fees. He was waiting for the 4:15 bus to Scranton. His brother's basement. A pull-out couch. He was thirsty. He walked to the vending machine and fed it bills. Punched the code. The bottle dropped, caught on the spiral, stuck. Once he would have yelled, kicked the machine, demanded a manager. Instead, he sighed. A young man nearby stood up. Hoodie, backpack, headphones around his neck. He bought a soda from the slot above. It fell hard, knocking the water loose. Both bottles clattered into the bin. The kid handed Richard the water. "Rough day?" Richard took it. His hands shook. He looked at the young man. Black, calm, kind. "Thank you," Richard whispered. "No problem," the kid said, smiling. "We're all just trying to get somewhere." The bus engine roared. Diesel filled the air. As the kid walked away, Richard sat there holding the cold bottle, finally understanding what he had lost and why. Far above the clouds, Flight 882 continued its daily run. New crew, new rule. Treat every passenger as if they own the plane. Because sometimes they do. The headlines didn't fade. They evolved. What started as a shaky live stream from Seat 2B became a case study, then a warning, then a mirror. Morning shows replayed the clip in slow motion. Evening panels dissected tone, posture, entitlement. Lawyers debated conduct clauses. Retired pilots spoke about authority in the air. Church basements and country clubs argued over dinner. The story slipped out of news cycles and into conversations where people didn't expect to see themselves reflected. Alyssa Morgan watched none of it. She learned long ago that attention was a solvent. It dissolved focus. She kept her routines, morning runs, black coffee, a legal pad filled with questions that began with why and ended with data. She sat in rooms where decisions were made quietly, where the loudest voice rarely won, where consequences were engineered, not improvised. At Morgan Capital, the acquisition team moved with precision. Warehouses were evaluated, routes optimized, ships reassigned, contracts rewritten. The brand was retired without ceremony. A new name rose in its place, clean and functional, like a phoenix without the theatrics. Employees noticed the difference immediately. Meetings ran shorter. Titles mattered less than outcomes. People were listened to. In one operations meeting, a senior manager hesitated before speaking. "We've never done it this way," he said, careful. Alyssa didn't look up from the spreadsheet. "That's why we're doing it," she replied. The room adjusted. Emily Carter returned to flying a week after the incident. The company offered her time off, counseling, a commendation wrapped in corporate language. She took none of it. She wanted the routine back, the aisle, the hum, the way you could reset a life every time the wheels left the ground. On her first flight back, a man in first class raised his voice at a woman in the aisle over an overhead bin. Emily didn't wait. She stepped in early, voice firm, eyes level. The man backed down. The woman mouthed, "Thank you." Emily nodded once. Small corrections mattered. They always had. At 30,000 feet over the Rockies, Emily caught her reflection in the galley mirror. She looked older, or maybe clearer. She thought of Alyssa, of the calm that had held under pressure, of the way power could be exercised without cruelty. Emily straightened her shoulders and went back to work. Richard Coleman tried to outrun the story. He deleted accounts, changed numbers, avoided places with screens. It didn't matter. Recognition followed him like weather. He learned the back doors of grocery stores. He learned which bars didn't have televisions. He learned the hours when fewer people were around. He applied for consulting work. No replies. He emailed old contacts, polite condolences, nothing else. He reached out to former board members. Silence. He was radioactive now. Not because of one moment, but because that moment had clarified years of behavior people had tolerated when it paid. One afternoon, he sat in a public library, the kind with chipped tables and the quiet hum of HVAC. He read articles about leadership, about accountability, about empathy. The words felt clinical, distant. He closed the laptop and stared at his hands. They looked smaller than he remembered. Across the room, A father helped his daughter with homework. She asked a question. He listened. He didn't interrupt. He didn't correct her mid-sentence. He waited. The patience struck Richard harder than the headlines ever had. In Zurich, Alyssa stood at a lectern and spoke to a room of engineers about efficiency losses in transitional phases. She used plain language. She credited junior analysts by name. When someone challenged her assumption, she paused, considered it, and adjusted the model. The room leaned in. Afterward, an older engineer approached her. 65, white hair, calloused hands. "I've been in this field 40 years, he said. "No one's ever listened like that." Alyssa smiled. It saves time. The policy memo went out a month later. It wasn't flashy. No slogans, no posters, just procedures. Clear escalation paths. Zero tolerance for harassment. Mandatory reporting. Real consequences. People noticed because it worked. Flight crews talked about it over coffee. "Feels different," someone said. "Like we're backed up now." They were. On a rainy afternoon in Newark, Richard boarded a bus with a paper ticket. He took a seat near the back, eyes on the window. As the city slid by, he caught sight of a plane climbing, banking toward the sun. For a moment, he imagined the cabin, the quiet, the hum. He felt the old pull of entitlement rise, then fall. There was nowhere for it to land anymore. The bus stopped. People got on and off. A woman struggled with a stroller. A man stood and helped without being asked. The driver waited. No one complained. Richard watched. He was learning slower now, but he was learning. That night, Alyssa sat at her desk and reviewed a report on fuel optimization. She made a note in the margin. Revisit assumptions about margin pressure in volatile markets. She closed the file and looked out the window. The city lights shimmered. The world felt heavy, but workable. She thought of the cabin, of the moment the door opened, of the silence before truth arrived. She didn't feel triumph. She felt alignment. Systems corrected when you applied the right force at the right point. Her phone buzzed. A message from Emily. "Just landed. Smooth flight." "Thank you." Alyssa typed back. "Safe travels." High above, another aircraft traced a white line across the sky, invisible from the ground. Inside, strangers sat shoulder to shoulder, each carrying a story no one else could see. Some were powerful, some were afraid, some were both. The rule held: treat every passenger as if they own the plane, because the cost of being wrong had finally been made clear. The invitation arrived without fanfare. No embossed seal, no dramatic subject line. Just a calendar block sent to Alyssa Morgan's assistant at 7:30 in the morning. Eastern Time. Senate Subcommittee on Transportation. Hearing on Passenger Conduct and Airline Authority. Washington, D.C. Alyssa read it once. Then again. She accepted. The hearing room smelled like old paper and fresh coffee. Flags stood rigid behind the dais. Cameras lined the walls, lenses black and unblinking. Alyssa took her seat at the witness table, posture relaxed, hands folded. She wore a charcoal suit, no jewelry. Nothing that asked to be admired. Everything that demanded to be taken seriously. Across the room, senators shuffled notes. Staffers whispered. The public gallery filled slowly, a cross-section of the country compressed into wooden benches. Retirees, students, industry reps, people who had flown enough to know the rituals and enough to know how quickly they broke. A senator leaned into the microphone. "Ms. Morgan, thank you for appearing." Alyssa nodded once. "Your experience on Flight 882 has sparked a national conversation," he continued. "Some say airlines have too much discretion. Others say not enough. What's your view?" Alyssa didn't rush. She let the silence work. "Airlines don't have a power problem," she said. "They have a clarity problem. Authority without accountability invites abuse. Accountability without authority invites chaos. You need both, clearly defined." Murmurs rippled. Another senator cut in. "But surely you understand that flight crews must make split-second decisions." "I do," Alyssa replied. "That's why the rules should protect them when they're right and correct them when they're wrong." "And who decides that?" someone asked. "Evidence," Alyssa said. "Process. And the willingness to believe people who don't look powerful." The room stilled. In the gallery, Emily Carter watched from the back row. She had flown in on her own dime, in uniform, on her day off. She sat straight, hands clasped, heart pounding. She'd testified before. Safety briefings, incident reports. Never like this. When Alyssa spoke, Emily felt something loosen inside her chest. Not validation, direction. Outside the hearing room, reporters waited. Questions flew. Alyssa answered a few, declined most. She left before the crowd could swell, slipping into a car that pulled away cleanly. That evening, the clip ran everywhere. Short, clean, unemotional. The soundbite that stuck wasn't the outrage. It was the line about clarity. People repeated it, wrote it down, used it in meetings. At Morgan Capital, a junior analyst watched the hearing on his phone during lunch. He looked around the break room, then spoke up. "We could apply this to our vendor reviews," he said. "Clear standards, documented escalation." His manager nodded. "Draft something. Small ripples. Again." Richard Coleman watched the hearing from a folding chair in a community center basement. The television was mounted too high. The sound tinny. He recognized the room. He'd been there twice already that week. Part of a program he'd resisted at first, then needed. Accountability sessions. Mandatory. Court adjacent. When Alyssa appeared on the screen, he looked down. Not out of shame, out of recognition. He had underestimated that feeling. How quiet it was. How permanent. After the session, a facilitator asked the group to speak. Richard didn't volunteer. He listened. A man talked about losing his temper. A woman talked about losing her job. The stories weren't dramatic. They were ordinary. That was the point. When it was Richard's turn, he cleared his throat. "I thought power meant being obeyed," he said. "I was wrong." No one clapped. No one interrupted. The facilitator nodded. That was enough. Months passed. The policy Alyssa had outlined hardened into regulation, not sweeping, targeted. Clear definitions of misconduct, mandatory recording of escalations, independent review boards. The industry grumbled, then adapted. It always did. Flight crews noticed first. The tone shifted. Early interventions replaced blow-ups. Training emphasized de-escalation and dignity. Complaints dropped. So did lawsuits. On a flight from Phoenix to Chicago, a man raised his voice at a gate agent over a delay. Another passenger stepped in, calm, firm. The man backed down. Later, he apologized. No one filmed. No one needed to. Emily Carter earned a promotion. Not announced publicly. Not symbolic. Real. She moved into training, mentoring new hires on judgment calls. She taught them to watch hands, eyes, breathing, to intervene before pride calcified into conflict. People don't snap out of nowhere, she told them. They escalate. Catch it early. She flew less, slept better. Alyssa returned to her routines. Runs before dawn. Coffee. Questions. She spoke less publicly now. Let the systems do their work. When asked about the flight, she answered once more, then stopped. The story no longer belonged to her. It belonged to everyone who saw themselves in it, for better or worse. One afternoon, she received a handwritten note. No return address. The handwriting uneven. Thank you for not yelling. Thank you for showing another way. She folded it and placed it in a drawer. In Newark, winter thawed into a hesitant spring. Richard found part-time work at a warehouse, inventory management, early shifts, heavy boxes, no office, no titles, just work. His supervisor was younger, smarter, patient. Richard listened. One day, a co-worker snapped at him over a miscount. The old heat rose, the urge to dominate, to correct loudly. Richard felt it, named it, let it pass. He corrected the count, moved on. That night, he slept. High above the country, planes continued their arcs, white lines against blue, invisible contracts between strangers and trust. In Seoul, people sat where they sat, some in first class, some in the back. All carried the same gravity. The lesson had traveled farther than the flight. It had landed where it needed to. The storm that followed was quieter than anyone expected. No shouting in the streets. No boycotts that burned hot and vanished. What came instead was procedural, methodical. The kind of reckoning that happens when institutions are forced to look at themselves without theatrics to hide behind. At airline headquarters across the country, compliance teams worked late. Policies were rewritten in plain language. Training videos were reshot without actors yelling or smiling too much. Real scenarios, real pauses, real mistakes. The kind that made people uncomfortable because they recognized themselves. Alyssa Morgan sat in a conference room overlooking a runway and watched a presentation click by without interrupting. Charts, timelines, metrics. Someone finished a sentence and waited. "Show me the exception path," she said. The presenter swallowed and pulled up another slide. This is where escalation happens if a crew member believes safety is compromised. And who reviews that decision afterward? Alyssa asked. A beat, an independent panel. Good, she said. Make sure it stays independent. She left before anyone could thank her. Emily Carter stood in a mock cabin with a group of new hires, the smell of recycled air and plastic, familiar and grounding. She played the role of the difficult passenger herself, raising her voice just enough, leaning into space, watching their reactions. Notice your hands, she told them when they froze. They go tight. That's your cue. Breathe. Lower your voice. Don't win, resolve, one trainee nodded, eyes wide. What if they won't back down? Then you escalate, Emily said. Early. Calmly. With witnesses, authority isn't volume. It's preparation. Across the country, a regional airline tested body cameras for flight crew during boarding, not as surveillance, as record. The footage showed patterns no one could argue with, where things went wrong, where they went right. Complaints dropped again. Richard Coleman didn't see any of it. He worked mornings now, inventory scanning and forklift checks, the warehouse echoing with beeps and rolling metal. He kept his head down, learned names, learned routes, learned how to ask for help without it feeling like surrender. One afternoon, a supervisor asked him to train a new hire, a kid, early 20s, nervous. Richard felt the old reflex spark, the urge to instruct sharply, to assert. He swallowed it. Let's walk it, he said instead. They walked it. At lunch, the kid asked him what he used to do. Richard paused. Logistics, he said. That felt true enough. He didn't add the rest. He didn't need to. The news cycle moved on. Another scandal. Another outrage. The flight faded into context, but the changes stayed, quietly embedded. Alyssa received fewer invitations now. She preferred it that way. She spent more time with engineers than executives, more time asking what failed than who. When a junior analyst sent her a late-night message apologizing for a mistake, she replied in the morning with a single line. Fix it. Show me what you learned. He did. On a flight to Denver, a woman hesitated at the curtain between cabins, ticket in hand, confused. A man behind her sighed loudly. A flight attendant stepped in gently, checked the pass, guided her forward. No scene, no judgment, just motion. Emily watched from the jump seat and felt a small, private satisfaction. In Washington, a senator quoted Alyssa's testimony during a debate. Clarity without accountability invites abuse. Accountability without authority invites chaos. The words sat in the record, unglamorous and solid. At Morgan Capital, quarterly numbers improved, not dramatically, reliably. The kind of growth that didn't need press releases. Alyssa approved a scholarship program for students from underfunded schools pursuing aerospace. She didn't announce it. The recipients found out when the letters arrived. One of them wrote back, I didn't think this world was for me. Alyssa read it twice, then archived it. Richard took the bus home again one evening, rain tapping the windows. He watched a plane lift off in the distance, lights blinking, climbing steadily. He didn't imagine himself inside anymore. He imagined the people, the small moments, the ways things could go wrong or right depending on choices made early. At home, his brother's house smelled like soup and detergent, a normal smell. Grounding. He washed his hands and sat at the table. They talked about nothing important. That felt like progress. Months layered over months. The policy reviews concluded. The training cycles repeated. New hires came in without knowing the story that had sparked it all. That was the point. Systems worked best when they outlived their origin myths. Emily received a note from a trainee months later. Used your breathing trick. Worked. Thank you. She pinned it to her corkboard. Alyssa stood on a balcony one evening, city spread below, planes threading the sky. She thought about control, about how fragile it was when mistaken for dominance, about how durable it became when shared. Her phone buzzed, a reminder. Flight in the morning. She packed light. At the airport, she moved through security unnoticed. Hoodie this time. Backpack. Headphones. She liked the symmetry. She boarded when her group was called. Took her seat. Window. Not 1A. Another number. It didn't matter. A man across the aisle glanced at her, then looked away. No judgment. No recognition. Just another passenger. The plane pushed back. Engines spooled. The hum settled in. Alyssa closed her eyes, felt the lift, and let the story continue without her needing to hold it anymore. The call came late. Not urgent. Not dramatic. Just a quiet vibration on Alyssa Morgan's phone as she stood in a hotel room in Seattle, city lights blurred by rain. She answered without looking at the screen. Yes, she said. A pause. Then Emily Carter's voice. I thought you should know, she said. It happened again. Different flight. Different people. Same pattern. And this time, it stopped before it became something else. Alyssa leaned against the window, cool glass at her back. Tell me. A man raised his voice at a woman during boarding, Emily said. Started with the seat, then the tone shifted. Another passenger intervened. Crew stepped in early, documented everything. He backed down, apologized, sat in his assigned seat. Alyssa closed her eyes. Good. That's it, Emily added. No arrests, no videos, no headlines. That's the goal, Alyssa said. Thank you for telling me. She hung up and stood there for a moment longer, listening to the city breathe. This was the part no one filmed. The absence of damage. The quiet corrections. The proof that prevention didn't need applause to be effective. The next morning, Alyssa walked into a meeting with a group of airline executives who had spent their careers avoiding eye contact with problems. They sat straighter now, listened longer, asked better questions. One of them, a man in his early 60s with a careful voice, cleared his throat. We were wrong, he said. We didn't see it. Alyssa nodded. You see it now? Yes, he said, and we don't want to go back. Then don't, she replied. The meeting ended on time. Across the country, Richard Coleman stood in line at the DM5, ticket number crumpled in his hand. The air smelled faintly of disinfectant and frustration. A television mounted in the corner played a muted daytime show. He waited and waited. When his number was called, he approached the counter without impatience. The clerk asked for documents. He handed them over. She stamped a form and slid it back. "Next," she said. Richard stepped aside. No argument. No demand. He walked out into the afternoon light, feeling lighter than he had in months. Not redeemed. Not forgiven. Just aligned with reality. At the warehouse, he finished his shift and helped a co-worker load a pallet without being asked. The supervisor noticed, said nothing. That felt earned. In Chicago, a retired pilot gave a talk at a community center about aviation safety. He spoke about systems, about redundancy, about how accidents rarely came from one failure, but from a chain of small ignored signals. A woman in the audience raised her hand and asked how that applied to people. The pilot smiled. "Same way," he said. "You don't wait for the crash." Emily Carter watched a training simulation where a new hire froze during a confrontation. She paused the video. "Right here," she said. "What are you feeling?" "Overwhelmed," the trainee admitted. "Good," Emily said. "That means you're paying attention. Now breathe and take the next smallest step." They ran it again. This time, it worked. Alyssa returned to New York for a brief stop. At a cafe near her office, a barista misheard her order and apologized too many times. Alyssa smiled and told him it was fine. He relaxed. The coffee tasted the same. She checked her email. A message from a foundation she supported. A student had completed their first solo flight. The note included a photo. Small plane. Wide skew. The student's grin visible even through the grain. Alyssa forwarded it to Emily with a single word. Progress. The response came back minutes later. Exactly. That night, Alyssa attended a small dinner. No press, no speeches. Just people who had stayed in the work long enough to understand it didn't end. Someone asked her if she ever thought about the flight. Yes, she said. Not the way people think. How so, they asked. I think about the moment before, she said. The breath people take when they decide whether to escalate or listen. They nodded. They understood. Richard Coleman took the bus home again, rain tapping the roof in a steady rhythm. A woman offered her seat to an older man. He thanked her. She shrugged. Ordinary decency. It struck Richard how invisible it was when it worked. He sat by the window and watched the city pass. He didn't think about what he had lost. He thought about what he had misunderstood. The difference mattered. At 30,000 feet, another flight crossed the night sky. Inside, passengers slept, read, stared at maps inching across screens. Somewhere between rows, a small tension rose and fell without breaking the surface. The system held. Alyssa packed for another trip. Light. Always light. She checked the weather, cleared her calendar, sent one last email approving a revision to a training module. She shut her laptop and looked around the room. There was nothing dramatic about it. No closing speech, no montage. Just continuity. Outside, a plane climbed, engines steady, wings level, carrying people who would never know how close something might have come to going wrong, and how quietly it had been set right. The work went on. The morning Alyssa Morgan flew out of New York, the airport moved the way it always had. shoes on polished floors, voices layered in overlapping announcements, screens blinking destinations that meant something different to everyone reading them. She blended into it easily, hoodie zipped, backpack light, headphones resting but not playing. She liked hearing the world before it receded. At the gate, a couple argued softly about seats, not angry, just tired. A gate agent listened, nodded, rebooked them without drama. The couple thanked her and stepped aside, shoulders loosening as if they'd been carrying weight they hadn't realized could be set down. Alyssa noticed the small things now, not because they were new, but because they were signs that systems were doing their job quietly. She boarded when her group was called, found her seat. Window. Middle of the cabin this time. No curtain, no ceremony. The man beside her smiled politely and went back to his book. Across the aisle, a woman tucked her purse under the seat and closed her eyes. The plane filled, the doors closed, the engine spooled. As the aircraft lifted, Alyssa felt the familiar press into the seat, the brief suspension between ground and sky. She exhaled. Not relief, alignment. She thought of the chain of moments that had brought them here. Not the confrontation, not the cameras. The decisions made afterward, when no one was watching. The emails that didn't go viral. The training sessions that ran long. The apologies that weren't performative. The habits that changed slowly because someone insisted they mattered. At cruising altitude, the cabin settled into its rhythm. A flight attendant passed with water. A child laughed somewhere behind her. A man typed carefully on a laptop, deleting more than he wrote. Ordinary life in a metal tube moving at impossible speed. On the ground, Richard Coleman clocked out at the warehouse and washed his hands at a sink that dripped. He looked at his reflection in the mirror. The lines were still there. The past hadn't vanished. But his eyes were quieter now. He dried his hands and stepped outside into the evening air. A bus passed. He waved it down. Paid with exact change. Took a seat near the back and watched the city go by. The rhythm of it felt less hostile these days. Not because the world had softened, but because he no longer expected it to bend around him. In a training room outside Dallas, Emily Carter wrapped up a session with a group of new hires. They stood straighter than when they'd arrived. Not confident, prepared. "Remember," she said, gathering her notes, "your job isn't to win. It's to keep people safe." They nodded. They would forget sometimes. Then remember again. That was how learning worked. In Washington, a policy brief crossed a desk and was approved without comment. In a regional office, a complaint was reviewed fairly and resolved early. In a break room, someone spoke up sooner than they used to. These things didn't make headlines. They made momentum. Alyssa woke mid-flight to sunlight spilling across the wing. Clouds stretched beneath them, soft and endless. She watched the shadow of the plane glide over them, steady, unbroken. She thought about ownership, how it had nothing to do with titles and everything to do with responsibility, how the quiet exercise of power could reshape a space without announcing itself. The plane began its descent. Seat backs upright, trays stowed. The ritual of landing. Alyssa felt the gentle jolt as the wheels met the runway. Applause rippled briefly, then faded. People stood, reached, gathered their things. Life resumed. As she stepped into the terminal, her phone buzzed. A message from an engineer. "We ran the numbers again. Your note was right. Efficiency up 3%. She smiled and typed back. "Good work." She moved with the crowd toward baggage claim. Just another traveler with somewhere to be. No one stared. No one knew. That was fine. Somewhere else, another flight pushed back. Another set of passengers took their seats. Another moment teetered and found balance before it tipped. The story kept going, not as a spectacle, but as a pattern. And now it rests with you. If this story moved you, tap like and subscribe so it can reach farther than a single flight. Then share your thoughts below using 3 words only. Keep it human.